Hello, class. Fortunately, I am digital once again. I am still stuck in jury duty. So today we're going to have a lecture over we'll call this a review lecture, some of the things that I think we need to kind of go over based on what I saw in the review on assignment 00. Now, before we begin, I'm not saying that this is something everybody needs to have a review on, and I'm not saying that everything that I'm going to go over is old material. There's certainly going to be some new things I'm going to discuss today. But there are going to be some things that for some of you may seem like a repeat or duplicate of things you saw or did in Digital Publishing 1, or maybe even possibly the basic graphic communication class, or those of you who may have taken the typography class. But before we begin, let me talk about assignment 00. If you go onto Blackboard, I have put a link on there to a YouTube video where I explain how that assignment could be done, and I've given some tips and different kind of techniques and skills that would make the layout more efficient. So before you do anything, before you actually watch this video, take some time and go and watch that video and kind of look how I went through that particular piece first before you start this video. But if you've already done that, great. Let's go ahead and get started with today's lecture on a review. Now, to begin with, I want to make sure everyone's on the same footing when it comes to some of the terminology that we're going to be using. So we're going to start off with talking about units of measurement that are used in publishing, and then we'll also talk about measuring type, because I want to make sure everyone's in the same place when it comes to measuring type. So to start off with, units of measurement. Now, I'm doing this lecture here using InDesign instead of the whiteboard behind me, because I just think from a video perspective it'll be a little bit easier if you can see this on the screen rather than try to look at what I'm writing behind me. So to get started, let's talk about the 3 units of measurement that we're going to be using in this class. Now, units of measurement, for those of you who grew up here in the United States, what we call the imperial system. You're probably used to things like inches and feet. Obviously, in other parts of the world that are not called the United States, they use the metric system, things like millimeters and centimeters and meters. In publishing, we're not necessarily going to focus on the metric system. We are going to focus on the imperial system because the units of measurement that we use in publishing are based around that imperial system. And what we're going to use are 3 different units of measurement. And the 3 units of measurement, and I'm just going to write here so everyone can kind of see, we have points, or what we call a digital point. We have picas, and of course inches. Make that a little bit bigger so everyone can see it here. So points, picas, and inches. Now, these make up the 3 main units of measurement that we're going to be using in this particular class. And these are ordered from smallest to largest. Points being the smallest, inches being the largest. Typically, we would use points to measure small things like type. Picas, we would typically measure things that are kind of medium size, like the size of maybe a text box or frame or an image that's placed on the actual screen. Inches would be used to measure larger things, like the overall trim size of the actual page. In this case, I'm using a letter half or digest format, which is 5.5 inches by 8.5 inches. And I would typically refer to that in inches, although you could use points and picas if you wanted to. So these are the 3 main units of measurement that we're going to be using in class. And as I mentioned, they go from small to large. And just to kind of show you what I'm talking about, let me go ahead and I will create a box. And I'm going to create this box, but then I'm going to come up here and I'm going to change its size. So I'm going to change it to 1 point, or 1 PT is the abbreviation for point, by 1 point. So you can see now this itty bitty little speck is actually 1 by 1 point. See how small that is? If I back out, there it is, that little red dot right there. That is a point. That's it. So a point is the smallest unit of measurement. Now, if we change that, let me back out now that I've selected it. I'm going to now put this into picas. So I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to change it to 1 pica. So I'm going to type 1p. P is the abbreviation for pica. PT is the abbreviation for point. So 1p by 1p, and now you can see what a 1 pica by 1 pica box looks like. Much larger than a point. So let me make sure everyone understands the abbreviations I'm using here. So this would be 1 PT would be a point. 1 pica, and I'll put a 0 there, and I'll come back to why that is in a minute, would obviously be for pica. So P is for pica, PT is for point. Inches can be written in one of two ways. You can either type 1 IN for inch, or you can use the inch mark. Either one will work. But how big is an inch compared to a pica? Well, let's see. So if I select this 1 pica by 1 pica box, I can come up here and I can type 1 inch by 1 inch. Notice these numbers don't relate to what I just typed, and I'll explain why in a minute. But this is now a 1 inch by 1 inch box, and you look how much larger that is compared to a 1 pica or even a 1 point box. So let me go back and address real quick why I was typing 1 inch up here, but it changed to what looks like 6 picas. If you go back and review the video I put for assignment 00, where I explained how I did that assignment, I mentioned that one of the nice features of InDesign is that anytime you have a box with a unit of measurement, in this case, my boxes actually have picas here. These are picas, okay, so notice the P. Anytime you have a box with a unit of measurement, you can type any measurement you want as long as you use the right abbreviation, and InDesign will do the conversion for you. So for instance, right now my rulers are all set up in picas. If I type 1 inch into this box, it'll convert inches into picas. If I type points, it'll convert points into picas. See how that works. Now if I change my ruler, if I come up here and right click on the point of origin where the two rulers meet, I can choose inches. Now when I come back and click on this, you'll see it says 1 inch by 1 inch. Now if I type in that box picas, it'll convert picas to inches. If I type points, it'll convert points to inches. It's really neat. There are some other really cool things that these boxes can do, including basic math, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And we'll get into those a little bit later on. But for right now, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that these are the three measurements: points, picas, and inches. And of those, points is the smallest, inches is the largest. The next thing we want to talk about is the conversion. So it's great that InDesign does this conversion for us, but without really understanding the conversion, relying on the computer to do it itself is never really a good thing. So what are the conversions? Well, first off, let me talk about points for a moment. And earlier on, I wrote digital points next to that. Now, what do I mean by digital point? Well, points and picas as a unit of measurement goes way back to the days of, ye old movable type and the Gutenberg press. A point back then was not quite a point that we have now. It was slightly, if I remember my history correctly, it was slightly larger than what we would consider a point today. Fast forward all the way to the days of computers and Adobe coming out with its publishing software, specifically PageMaker. During that particular time, Adobe decided that we couldn't really have, these points kind of be a fraction and end up not having a whole number of points equal an inch. So what they decided to do is that instead of it having to be like 72 and 5/8 of a point equals an inch, they just decided to round and make it to where 72 points equals 1 inch. So in this case, if I have 72 points, right, or the abbreviation is PT, that would equal 1 inch, or IN, or the inch mark, whichever one you want to actually use, okay? That is your first conversion. There are 72 points, or technically speaking, 72 digital points in 1 inch. So Adobe kind of redefined this unit of points, and it makes it a whole lot easier to do all these conversions. So anytime I say points in this class, just understand I'm talking about digital points. If you go out and find an old letterpress and find an old case of sorts of metal movable type, those point systems aren't quite exactly the same, but they're similar enough to where they're kind of interchangeable. So anytime I say points, I mean digital points. Point is, though, 72 points to an inch. Well, that's great. What about picas? How many points are in a pica? Well, there are 12 points, or PT, into 1 pica, or P in this particular case. So 12 points in 1 pica. Now, for those of you who are good at math, you probably know the next conversion I'm going to, and that is how many picas are in an inch. So there's 72 points in an inch, 12 points to a pica. That means that there are 7 picas, P, in 1 inch. Didn't mean to put that question mark there. Does everybody see that? My OCD is getting to me. Sorry about that. 6 picas in 1 inch. 12 points in a pica. And there's 72 points in an inch. If you memorize these 3 conversions, you can pretty much convert from one measurement to another. Now, I'm not going to ask you to do a ton of conversion in this class by hand, obviously, because InDesign does that for you. But you do need to understand how these conversions actually work. Furthermore, I want to focus on this conversion right here in the middle, the 12 points equals 1 pica, because how you actually write picas differs from anything else. In inches, we're kind of used to writing in inches, right? An inch and a half is 1.5. An inch and a quarter is 1.25, if we're talking decimals, right? Points are really simple. They're whole numbers. If you need a fraction of a point, you write them just like you would any decimal. 6.5 points is 6.5 points. Okay, that all makes sense. But picas are written differently, and it's because of this conversion that there are 12 points in a pica that makes it different from any other unit of measurement. You see, because a pica is not counted like we would normally count numbers. Now, I'm getting a little bit of math, and I know some people are going to go, no, not math. I understand. Just bear with me for a moment. It will all make sense in a minute. The math that we're all used to, and we count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, is what we call base 10 math, right? It's in groups of tens, basically, right? Well, picas, if you'll notice, there are 12 points that make up a pica. So this is actually base 12. So in order to go from 1 pica to 2 picas, each pica has to have 12 points. We're used to saying in order to go from a 10 to 20, each of those have to have 10, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Those are 10s, right? Picas are counted by 12s. So in this case, if I were writing 1.5 picas, a half a pica is 6 points. Follow me? So in this case, I'm not writing 1.5p. There's no such thing. 1.5p doesn't exist. What I do is I say this is 1 pica, 6 points. See how those numbers work? Earlier on, I wrote that 0. That meant 0 points. 1 pica, 0 points. This, in this case, means 1 pica, 6 points. Or if you want to convert it, 1.5 picas, because 6 points is half a pica. And that's how this number is actually done. So if I say 1 pica, 11 points. When I get to 12, I don't write 1 pica, 12 points. I simply write 2 picas, 0 points. So hopefully that nomenclature, the way that that's actually written, makes sense to you. The important thing to remember, though, is that there are 12 points in 1 pica, and that you write picas based on that conversion, which is why if I were to come in here and change my rulers back to picas, and I were to, let's select this particular box. If I come up here in the ribbon, you'll notice that the width is 17 picas, 1.8 points. Or the height is 8 picas, 1.2 points. See how that's written? So that is the important thing to understand about how picas are written. All right, and that's it. That's all we need for units of measurement. Points, picas, inches, points are the smallest, inches are the largest. You got to understand that 72 points are in an inch, there are 12 points in a pica, and that there are 6 picas in an inch. As long as you get that conversion down, you memorize that, everything else is easy. But again, even if you don't quite remember those particular measurements and conversions, InDesign will help you out, because at any point in time, I can come in here and I can type in a specific unit and it'll do the conversion for me. It's as simple as that. Well, let's move on to measuring type. And here I have in this document just a simple sentence that I'm sure probably everybody has seen up to this point. The brown fox jumps over the lazy river. And this text is actually sitting on a red line. So what we're going to talk about today is how we actually measure type. Now, type or text, for the most part, fonts, are usually the smallest element on a page. A single letter is considered the smallest element that makes up a page of text. So typically, because it is the smallest, we would use the smallest unit of measurement to measure it, which would be points. So what we're going to go over is kind of like the anatomy, or well, really it is the anatomy of measuring text. So to start off with, again, here is our text, and it is sitting on a red line. And we, of course, call this the baseline. So the baseline, I'll just type that out here, the baseline. The baseline is this red line that we have right there. It is the line in which the text sits on. Now, we remember this all the way back from grade school, right? The teacher told us, we had to write on the line. That's the baseline. That's the baseline that it sits on. Now, the baseline is very important, especially later on when we talk about a concept called vertical rhythm and leading, which we'll get into in just a minute. But I want to focus on a couple of other areas that make up measuring type. So, with that being said, let's move on. I'm going to go ahead and grab the line tool here, and I'm going to create another line. That line is what we call the X height. So if we look in this text, you'll notice that we do actually have a lowercase x. And the lowercase x should actually define the height of what we call the X height. And that's a little bit big. Let me change that down. There we go. Bring that down a little bit. All right. So if you look at this the black line now, the black line is touching just the top of the lowercase x. That is considered the X height. Now the X height, a lot of people get this confused and think this is the height of lowercase letters. Sort of. Not really. Depending on the font that you're actually using, there may be lowercase letters that actually extend above the X height. Look at the lowercase t as an example. In a lot of these kind of serif fonts, the R, the terminal in the R, that little bit that kind of comes off, that kind of curls around, sometimes that terminal goes above the X height in certain fonts. So the X height is not exactly the measurement of the height of the lowercase letters, but it certainly does measure the height of the lowercase x, which a lot of the lowercase letters kind of use that particular measurement to kind of come from. So, but the X height is important, and we measure the X height starting from the baseline. All of these measurements, except for one that I'll get into in a minute, all start off with measurement from the baseline. The next one I want to talk about, and I'm just going to shift this black line instead of rewriting it, recreating it all the time. I'm going to bring this up here to the top of the uppercase T in the word the. This is called the cap height, or the height of capital letters. So if you look at the capital T in the word the, you'll notice that line is now touching. So from the baseline to this line is considered the cap height. Now, a lot of people will confuse this with the overall height of the font, but if you'll notice, the lowercase f, the lowercase b, the lowercase h, the lowercase l, all has parts of those particular type go above the cap height. So it's not enough to say that that is the proper height of the actual text. It's just not the case. A lot of fonts, especially sans serif fonts, will have the uppercase letters slightly smaller than these lowercase letters that I just pointed out right here. And in fact, there is an actual measurement, a line, to measure the top of those lowercase letters. So I just push that up just a little bit, and you'll see that line now touches the top of the lowercase h, b, f, the lowercase l in this line of text. The part of a lowercase letter that extends all the way up to this line is called the ascender. So in this case, if we take a look, this is the F, the lowercase f for the fox. And in this particular case, if I come up, this particular piece right here that comes up and touches the line is considered an ascender. So this is called the ascent line, or the ascender line, depending on which anatomy you're looking at. But usually it's considered the ascent line. And the ascent line measures exactly from the baseline to the top of the ascender. the ascent line. Now, the last one we're going to talk about is called the descent line. And if you're following along, you probably have already figured out exactly what this measures. In fact, and I'm just going to copy this as I bring this down here, you'll notice that the lowercase letters, in this particular case, the lowercase j, p, and y, has a part that actually descends below the baseline to where this other line that I've now placed. This is called the descent line. And the descent line is basically that measurement. The descent line goes from the baseline to that descent line, and it measures what are called descenders. So lowercase letters can have ascenders or descenders. Now, these two lines that I have marked, the ascent line and the descent line, are very important. A lot of us, and let me scroll over here for a second, hold on. Not scroll, but roll. There we go, rolling right back. A lot of us have one of these, which is a line gauge. If you're not familiar with these, hopefully you have one. Hopefully it's showing up on the screen. And during the course of one of your classes here, you were probably taught on how to measure type using one of these line gauges. And you were probably taught using what are called these E-scales. You can probably see, do this real quick. You can see all the E's that are on this particular line gauge. And you got all these different ones that are down here. Now, these kind of E-scales are good to kind of get in a ballpark, but if you'll notice, the E that we have here is a capital E, and specifically it's a sans serif font. Well, what happens if you've got a serif font and you don't have any capital E's? How do you measure the font? Well, glad you asked. Let me explain. It kind of goes back to these two particular lines that I just drew, the ascent line and the descent line. What you would typically do in order to get the measurement or the size of the font. So in this case, if I were to select this, it says it's a 20-point font. In order to measure the size of the font, I would measure from a descent line to the ascent line. I would take my line gauge and I would place it on those two lines. Now you may say, well, whenever I'm measuring type on something I've been given, I don't have those lines. Well, you draw them. So you would take your line gauge, you would put it on the piece of paper, and you would use it like a ruler, and you would just create a straight line over all the ascenders and over all the descenders in a line of text, and then use your point scale. And in the case of these ones right here, these line gauges, the point scale is this itty bitty little point scale right here, and I would use that point scale to actually measure from those two lines that I created, and that should give me a more accurate measurement of the actual type. And it's important to know that because you are measuring from ascent to descent, every single font's going to be different. Just because this is 20 points, that's great. But if I get another font that is slightly bigger or slightly smaller or whatever it is, if I have bigger ascenders or bigger descenders, I'm going to have a completely different font size. But the point is that to get the measurement right, you want to measure from ascender to descender. And that is the proper way to measure the type. It will get you probably within a point or two of the actual font size, if not nail it exactly. So keep that in mind whenever you're measuring type. All right, let's move on to rhythm. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new document here. There we go. Now, rhythm is probably a word many of you have heard, but not associated with publishing before. A lot of times, whenever we talk rhythm, we're talking, do you have good rhythm, right? Music. And in this case, it's pretty much one and the same. Whenever I discuss rhythm, there's two types of rhythm in any sort of publishing layout. There is horizontal rhythm, and then there is vertical rhythm. The concept as a layout artist to understand rhythm is that you want to try to create consistency. Now, let me take a step back here real quick and try to explain what's the point of all of this. As a layout artist, somebody who lays out text, or not even just text, but somebody who does an actual layout, your goal is to create a layout that communicates properly to the user. Now, In a lot of cases, we think more of like illustration work, like posters and things like that, and that's or advertising, and that's fine. But when we're talking about strictly type-based layout, there is a thought process that you need to go through when it comes to communicating with the reader. And a lot of these rules that we're discussing here have to deal with properly communicating with the reader by laying out the content in a way that makes it efficient and easy for the reader to consume that content. So one of the ways that we do that is through consistency, adding consistency in our layout. For instance, you may have heard, don't use more than 3 different kinds of fonts. You don't want one paragraph in, Times New Roman, another paragraph in Helvetica, and another paragraph in, heaven forbid, Comic Sans. You want to have consistency in your layout. At the same time, you don't want to have, your paragraphs ragged all over the place. You don't want to have, inconsistent. If you're adding color to your text, you don't want to have it look like a giant rainbow. There's a lot of things that go into the layout itself and making sure that the layout is readable and efficient for the reader. And one of those things is rhythm. So when I talk about rhythm, just understand that yes, you can kind of equate this to musical rhythm as far as consistency in your rhythm. And for those musicians, quarter notes, eighth notes, 16th notes, a division of rhythm. We do the same thing, but we do it on a visual scale here because that's what we're doing. We're doing visual layout. So when I talk about rhythm, I'm talking about a visual rhythm. So what does that look like? Well, I'm going to start off here by creating some text. It's going to go here in this box. So I'm going to go up to my type menu, and I'm going to fill this thing with a bunch of lorem ipsum or placeholder text. So in this case, I've got several different paragraphs of text that's all kind of laid out just as it is. Now, when we talk about horizontal rhythm, we're talking about how the user perceives this particular content horizontally. So what does all this mean? Well, when we're just talking about the text, some things that make up horizontal rhythm. One of those happens to be alignment. So if I were to select a paragraph and I were to change its alignment to center align, if we now take a look at how this is laid out horizontally, and then look at the next paragraph and we see how it's laid out horizontally, we lose consistency. Now that may be done on purpose. For instance, this top paragraph may not be a full paragraph of text. Maybe it's only one sentence. Like, oops, let me put that back to the left align, like so. And we put that as we change its horizontal rhythm compared to all the other paragraphs to make it stand out, to give it contrast. That could be the case. So horizontal rhythm can play an important part. Furthermore, horizontal rhythm also plays a part in how you align your text. So it's not just about what type of alignment you use, left, center, or right, but even within those particular alignments, how do you set it up? For instance, if we take a look here at this second paragraph, this second paragraph is aligned left, meaning the left side of the text is flush. The right side of the text is what we call ragged. So this is what we call align left or ragged right. One of those two terms, they mean the same thing. Sometimes you'll do a layout and you don't want this sort of imbalance from the left side where it is aligned to the right side where it's ragged. Sometimes you want to have consistency. In that case, we have alignment like justified text. Now, the left side and the right side are equal, are even. There's a balance there. Do you see that? That balance gives us a good sense of rhythm. Now, in all cases, you're not going to sit there and just justify everything you come across, but that's one way to add a nice, consistent rhythm to your individual text. In fact, if you go back and take a look at a lot of the books that you may read, you'll find that a lot of books, even newspapers, use justified text to kind of create that nice sense of rhythm. Excuse me. So the horizontal rhythm is very important. But it's not just about alignment of text within a paragraph. It also is sometimes the alignment of individual characters within the text. So I were to delete this, and I were to say, hey, I want an A and a V here. Let me increase the size. That will make it even bigger than that. Okay, so here are two characters that have an A and a V. And if you'll notice, there is space, horizontal space here, between these two characters. Now, sometimes, even when you kind of really drill down into these individual characters, there's room for improvement when it comes to your rhythm. Sometimes when you're dealing with these kind of fonts, it will try to automatically justify the space between the letters, or what we call kerning. A lot of times, the automatic kerning built into a font works very well. Other times, not so much, especially when you're dealing with larger type, things like titles or headings. You may need to go in and individually adjust the kerning between two characters to kind of bring those characters closer together or further apart to kind of create a consistent amount of spacing horizontally across the word. So whenever you need to do that, of course, you place your cursor between the two letters, and you can come up here and you can start adjusting your kerning. If you'll notice, in this particular case, let me type that again, the automatic kerning for this particular font at 60 points in the size is -97 on the kerning. And I can, of course, adjust that manually if I want by bringing those closer together or pulling them further apart by adjusting that kerning either positively or negatively. So in this case, I may want that V a lot closer to that A. So instead of -97 in the kerning, I may want to go ahead and put -200 in to create a much closer close the proximity between those two particular characters. That is also an aspect of horizontal rhythm. And if we take that one step further out, this being the smallest, paragraph alignment being the largest, the tracking or the spacing between multiple characters within a line is also something that you can adjust as well. So think about, whenever you're laying out text, think about how things are laid out throughout the entire document. And also think about, what does that do to the readability of that text for the reader? Does it make it easier for the reader to follow along? Does it make it more difficult? Next thing we want to talk about is measure. Now, I'm going to come back here and I'm going to undo that. That's going to take me forever. So we'll go back 12 on this. Come back here, 12. And we will go back into fill with placeholder text. All right. Now, back here with placeholder text, the next thing we want to talk about is measure. Now, what exactly is a measure? Well, a measure is actually just a line of text. Specifically, it's the length of a line of text. So if I were to measure the length of a line of text in my document, essentially here in InDesign, it's going to be the overall width of my text frame. So this text frame, if we look up here, has a width of 27 picas. So I could say that this particular layout uses a measure length of 27 picas. That's what we talk about when we say a measure. Now, why is that important? Well, measure length is one of these things that can make or break a layout. Let me ask you a question. How many of you have ever read a book? Maybe it was a textbook. And you start reading a line of text. You go down to the next line of text, only to find yourself rereading the same line. Has that ever happened to you? It's happened to me. And you tend to kind of doubt yourself when that happens, right? You start thinking to yourself, I need more coffee. I haven't had enough sleep. This book is boring. This content is just not holding my attention. Some of that may be true. Heavens no, I need more coffee. But a lot of times what happens is that the reason why you're reading the same line over again has nothing to do with the content, has nothing to do with how tired you are, has everything to do with an incorrect measure length. Whenever you end up with a ridiculously long line of text, and then you follow that line of text at the end and you follow back with your eye, If there is not enough space given between those lines of text, or the line length is way too long, the measure length is too long, you can easily find yourself missing your place from the end of one line to the beginning of the next. That's a major problem in layout. And that is why it's very important to understand how measure length works. Now, in order to understand the proper size of a measure, I've got a nice little table from this particular book right here. This is the Elements of Topographic Design by Robert Bringhurst. It is widely kind of considered well, I'd say the Bible of typography and type layout. This book kind of goes in and out of publication several times. This is, I think, the second edition that I have here. Yeah, second edition I have here. I have a first edition hardback at my house. You can get these. You can find them at half-price books. It's not a required text, but if this is an industry that you want to get into, try to find yourself a copy of this. But more importantly, there is a copy fitting table in this particular book that we're going to use that I have actually copied itself. And let me see if I can find it. And there it is. So this is a copy fitting table, this one right over here. And I'm going to bring it up on the screen in a minute so you can see it. But what I do want you to see, hopefully what's popping up on your color, is that there is a red section in the middle of this copy fitting table. That's not going to show up on your digital. It's going to show up as bold in your digital. But in this particular case, this copy fitting table attempts to try to tell us as layout artists what is an ideal measure length given the typeface and the size of the font that we've chosen. Let me back up and say that one more time. Robert Bringhurst in his book has basically created a table. That table tells us what is the length of a measure of text, an ideal measure length, based on the typeface that we're using, Times New Roman, Helvetica, even Comic Sans, and the size of the font, 12 points, 14 points, 18 points. If we know the typeface we're using and the size of the font, we can look up that information in the table, and the table will tell us what is the measure length that is considered ideal. Now, how is this calculated? Well, a measure length is calculated by the number of characters in a line. So if we take a look at this first line of text that I have here, which it's Latin, I understand, this line of text has a certain number of characters, which, by the way, punctuation and even spaces count as a character. So even this space here between these two words, that would be considered a character. So when we measure our line of text, the measure length itself, we want to make sure that the measure length allows for a certain number of characters that is considered an ideal amount. So what is that ideal? Well, again, going back to the Bringhurst book, for a long time, traditionally speaking, and these are all traditional rules, cue up Captain Barbossa in the Pirates of the Caribbean, more like guidelines rather than rules, but these are the rules, traditional rules of typesetting. The ideal measure length would have 66 characters in it. Write that down if you're taking notes. 66 characters. That is pretty much the ideal measure length that you want to get for any size font. But just like any ideal, there's kind of a low end and a high end. So what is that range? What range of characters is considered acceptable? If 66 is ideal, what's acceptable? An acceptable range of characters would be between 45 and 75 characters. So 66 is the ideal. 45 is the low end for adequate. So that's kind of the range that we're talking about. But that's great if we're counting characters, but I don't want to sit here and have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This would get boring very, very quickly. So how do we do this? Well, that's where this copy fitting table comes into play. So I have this copy fitting table right here, actually already queued up. And in fact, on Blackboard, if you go to this class on Blackboard, In the left column, I've created a new section called Resources, where you can download your very own copy of the Bringhurst copy fitting table. It's yours to use. You're welcome. So let me explain, though, how to read this particular table. Again, I'm not focused on this left page. It's only this right page here that I really care about. So let's take a look at this particular table and see exactly how in the world do we actually read this thing. So if we look over here, it gives us some instructions. In the left column, this column right here is let me highlight this column is the length of your typeface's alphabet, lowercase alphabet, in points. Wait, what in the world does that mean? Well, let's come back in here and I'll show you exactly what I mean. Right now, I'm using Minion Pro. Let me change that typeface to Times New Roman. Okay? If I were to type out the lowercase alphabet of Times New Roman at 12 points, it's regular, 12 points. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M. Sing along with me, that's fine. P, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. There's the lowercase alphabet. All right. The length of that alphabet is what I need to find in points. That's the number I'm going to look at here in this left column. Well, that's the first piece of information that I need, right? I need to know I'm going to be using Times New Roman. I'm going to be using 12 points as the font size. Okay, great. How do I figure out what the actual size of this alphabet happens to be? And not only that, but I need to figure it out in points. Okay, well, two quick little tips. Let me show you how to do this in InDesign. First, you will have to actually type out the lowercase alphabet like I did right here. Second, we need to make sure that the width of this text frame matches the width of the alphabet I just typed. And if you go back to the A00 video, I showed you how to use fitting. So we're going to use that here right now. So if I right-click on this particular frame and I go down to fitting, I'm going to choose fit the frame to content. Now, you look, the frame fits just the lowercase alphabet. Do you see that? The width is just the lowercase alphabet. And if I have this selected up here, it says the width is 11 points, 11.303, or excuse me, 11 picas, 11.303 points. Ugh, fractional points. Terrible. How do I do this? Well, I'm going to change my rulers up here to points, and I get 143 and some change, give or take. 143 points. So that means if I'm using 12 point Times New Roman, the lowercase alphabet is about 143 points in length. So let's go back to the copy fitting table. So here in the left column, I want to try to find a number as close to 143 as possible. In fact, if I round up, I'll see I have 145 right here. So this is the row I'm going to use. Sorry about that. So I'm going to, I cannot stand this new trackpad. I'm going to highlight this row, and this is the row that we're going to use. So in this case, 12 point Times New Roman has a length of a lowercase alphabet of 143 points. So I've identified in this table 145 is as close as we can get. So this is the row that we're going to look at. The row starting with the number 23 and ending with 94 are the number of characters in a measure. Now remember, going back a few minutes ago, I said an ideal measure length is 66 characters long. But an adequate range is between 45 characters and 75 characters. So what we want to do is we want to try to find the ideal length first. Try to fit an ideal measure length in our page, if we can, using 12.9 Times New Roman. So if we look in this row, and we can actually find that 66 characters is actually listed in that row. Great. Well, now what? Well, if we come back over here to the instructions, it says if we read across, The top row, right up here, it starts at 10 and goes to 40, is the line length or the measure in picas. So how does that help us out? Well, here's how it helps us out. If we come back over here to the left column and we find 145 points, because that's the closest to 143, we come all the way across that row and we find 66 characters. If we go all the way to the top of that column, we get the number 28. Does everybody see that? Come all the way down here. Okay, we find 145. We come all the way here and find 66. And from 66, if we come all the way up, we get 28. So 28 is the number of picas, the length of our measure. So that's what we want to do. Hey, no, it's okay. I'm just recording the lecture.
Oh, you're good.
I'll be done shortly.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, it's all right. Cleaning crew, I'm recording this on Tuesday night. So 28 picas is going to be the length of our measure. So how do we do this in our layout? If I go back into InDesign, this InDesign layout means that I want to create a text frame that is 28 picas in width. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a text frame here, just a standard text frame. There we go. And after I select this text frame, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to convert my rulers back to picas. This text frame, when I created it, because of how I set my margins up, is 27 picas. Well, I need to make it 28 picas. So this is now the size or the width of a text frame that would fit an ideal measure length using Times New Roman. Go back to Times New Roman, 12 points. So if I fill that with placeholder text and I back this off and we see that, that is now considered the ideal measure length, meaning that is the proper width of a line of text that is ideal for the reader in terms of comfort. Now, if you take a look at that, I'm sure each of us have read things like textbooks, for instance, that have line lengths a whole lot longer than that. And that's probably why the reason whenever you read textbooks, you rub your eyes, you're rereading lines over again, you're like, I can't get this information. It's not because the information's bad or because you're not quite getting the information or you're not comprehending it. The reason why is because whoever laid out the book did it wrong. So next time, you're reading a textbook from a professor and you just can't quite get it, blame the layout artist, not necessarily the author. Content could be bad, but more than likely it was the layout artist who has basically hindered you from being able to comprehend that in a very easy, natural, flowing kind of way. So measure length is very, very important, and you can figure all that out using these particular copy fitting tables. So again, this copy fitting table is available to anybody right now on Blackboard. Just go to the resource section, download a copy for yourself. And that's measure length. Now, there are a couple of rules when it comes to measure length. For instance, if you have shorter measures, so we're talking smaller than ideal, in those particular cases, like the one I have here, it's best to kind of have a left alignment. In other words, we kind of want to have this ragged right kind of a situation, because as you have a smaller and smaller measure length, you do not want to have justified text, because the smaller and smaller your measure length gets, the less of an opportunity the program has to kind of stretch those letters out. This is why, in some cases, if we were to make this smaller and smaller and smaller, get to a point where you can kind of start to see things, you'll start to see things open up what we call rivers. So if we take a look at this, you can see these big gaps that kind of start to form inside of the actual text. Those are called rivers. Here's a big one right here. So we can start here and come all the way down. Grab yourself a raft and go right down the text. You probably have seen this. Very familiar if you've ever read a lot of newspapers. They'll have a lot of rivers. But they consider that just a byproduct of the actual trade. It's It's compromised. But whenever you're doing this in like a book format or a magazine format, you do not want rivers. So the smaller the measure length becomes, the less chance you have to using things like justified text. You're better off in this case to actually just do left align and allow these kind of ragged end of your lines show up in the text. It makes it easier for the reader, and that's what it's all about. So shorter measures are better for ragged right. You want to try to keep the measure length between the following numbers. I already told you about characters, right? 45 to 75 characters. But what if you don't have a copy fitting table, right? You left your copy at home. You don't have access to one online. You don't have a printout of the sheet. So you don't have a way to be able to figure that out. How do I kind of ballpark this? Well, what you can do is you can take the font size. So in this case, my font size is 12 points. And what you can do is you can multiply that by 20 to 40 times. So in this case, I have a 12-point font. If I multiply that by 20, what I would end up with is 240. That would be the measure length in points. So that would be my low end of my scale. So if you're without a copy fitting table, just multiply the font size between 20 and 40 times, and that will kind of give you a good ballpark, that kind of adequate range to be able to set up your measure length. Okay? All right. One other thing I do want to point out, that while we're sitting here with this paragraph of text, if everyone will kind of take a look here at this period, let me scroll in a little bit further, or zoom in. Here's the end of a sentence. It is a period. Notice how many spaces follow the end of a sentence. 1. Many of you have picked up a trait, I guess I'll call it, maybe a trait, from your English teachers. And that is, when typing a letter, when you come to the end of a sentence, you hit the space bar how many times? 2 times, right? Well, that's actually incorrect. When we're doing layout, in this particular case, we want to be as precise as possible. The double space after a sentence is actually an old Victorian typewriter rule, back when we had monospace fonts. Do not, under any circumstances, if you are manually typing text that is going to be laid out in any sort of copy, do not double space after the sentences. Furthermore, later on when we talk about how to search and replace content within InDesign in a very smart, efficient way, I'll show you ways to be able to locate where maybe if you got the copy from a client, where maybe they're double spacing, because everybody, there's a lot of people who use that, where you can locate 2 spaces after a sentence and remove one of those spaces to bring it back into normal traditional typesetting rules. So, quick little point: don't double space after your sentences. I can lecture you about the Oxford comma, but we're not going to get into any of that. So let's move on. Let's talk about vertical rhythm now. So, talked about horizontal rhythm. What about vertical rhythm? So here I have a paragraph. What exactly constitutes vertical rhythm? Well, a couple of things. First and foremost, the most important aspect of vertical rhythm when we're talking text is going to be a measurement called leading. So if we go back to my measuring type example here, where I had this red line, which was the baseline, if you could picture in your mind's eye a baseline under each line of text. Now, the concept or the measurement of leading is defined as the measurement of baseline to baseline. Let me repeat that one more time, because some people have a misconception of what leading is. A lot of people think it's space between lines. That's not it at all. When we are measuring leading here in a digital document, the measure of leading is from baseline to baseline, not the space between the lines. It's baseline to baseline. So in this case, if you'll look up here, my leading is currently set to 14.4. There's a parenthesis around it. Parentheses always mean this is an automatic setting from the typeface itself. So whoever created, in this case, Times New Roman, believed that at 12 points, 14.4 points, or the measurement from baseline to baseline, would be considered automatic or ideal. That's not always the case. Sometimes you may want to adjust the particular leading. In fact, let me give you some rules when it comes to how you can adjust your leading. And it all goes back to measure length, the line of text, how long your line of text happens to be. So let's talk about that. If you have a leading, if you have a measure length that is longer than ideal, remember I gave you that kind of adequate. Ideal is 66 characters. If you're on that further end, closer to 75 or even further, or you're past 40 times the font size, if you're kind of ballparking it by multiplication, if you're on that outer end of your measure length, you need to increase the leading, because the white space that is created by increasing your leading gives the eye something to track as it comes back across the page to pick up the new line. In fact, if you've ever found yourself again rereading the same line, a couple things. It was probably too long of a measure and too narrow of a leading. It didn't have enough gap, enough white space to allow your eye to track back across the line. That's a big problem. So anytime you have a long line of text, you need to have more leading. Furthermore, if we get into the leading itself, larger bodied faces need more lead than smaller bodied faces. So anytime you have things like bold, as opposed to a thinner style font, like a condensed font, those bold or black letters need more leading, more white space to kind of let them breathe a little bit more than if I have a condensed font. So you have to think about the type of font that you're using, not just the actual overall measure length. Furthermore, anytime you have things like sans serif or serif fonts, sans serif fonts, in this case I have a serif font, but sans serif fonts like Helvetica or Arial need a little bit more leading than a serif font. So if I'm using Times or Times New Roman, 2 points of lead, in other words, I have a 12-point font and 14 points of leading, that's a difference of 2. 2 points of lead may be enough in that case. But if I'm using Helvetica, well, let's just try that. If I have this set to Helvetica, and we'll do Helvetica regular, okay, and I set that to 14 points, that might be too narrow. I may have to increase that. Instead of 14 points of leading, I may need to increase it to 15 points. And all of a sudden, just that one change right there, you go 14, 15. You can kind of feel yourself kind of go, right? Just giving yourself just a little bit extra white space, a little bit more leading can actually make the text look more inviting. So you got to think about that. The measure length and the typeface that you're using can dictate what you're doing with your actual leading. So think about that a little bit more. Longer measures, larger measures need more leading, right? The typeface that you're choosing may dictate more leading. Now that doesn't mean it's cumulative. In other words, it's not like saying, well, if I've got a longer measure with bolder font and I'm using a sans serif font, well then I'm going to add 1, 2, 3, maybe 3 or 4 extra points of lead. So you end up with something like this. You know, it's not like you're adding them all together. However, there is an upper end when it comes to leading. Like, you don't want to go past this particular point. And that point is, if you look at the font size, in my case, I'm using a 12-point font. If you multiply that by 1.5 or 1.5, so in this case, 12 times 1.5 is 18. I don't want to go past 18. So this is, if I were to select this and I begin to increase, so that's 15 points of font. 16, 17, 18. That is, if I take a look at this, that is the outside edge. That's as far as I want to go with this particular font with my leading. Okay, that is 6 extra points of leading. So there you go when it comes to leading. Now, I said that's one aspect of dealing with vertical rhythm. The other aspect of vertical rhythm would be white space itself, or spacing between elements. So if we kind of come back here, let me get rid of this. Let me put in some more. Let's see, where are we at? Okay. So if I'm going to fill this with placeholder text again. There we go. All right. So I have one paragraph here, one paragraph here, and one paragraph here. If you'll notice, there's no space between these paragraphs. But if I select that and go to my paragraph settings, and I can go to space after, I can actually increase the spacing. See how I'm increasing the spacing? That itself is also an aspect of vertical rhythm. The consistent spacing between elements. Now, how do you determine how much space? Right now, I put 9 points. Is that enough? Should I put 10? 12? What should it be? In this particular case, when you are laying out paragraphs and you're putting space between paragraphs, the traditional way of doing it would be to make the space between the paragraphs equal to the leading. So if I take a look at my leading, let's say I set my leading to, let's say 15 points, okay? Then what I would want to do is I also want a space between my paragraphs, 15, whoops, that made it 15 points, there we go, 15 points. So then the idea is that you want to have a consistent look. Baseline to baseline is 15 points. This is also 15 points of space. That gives me a nice consistent look and feel, not only from line of text to line of text, but from block of text to block of text. And I would do the same thing if I lay out an image or a table or any other element in my page. I would want that white space that frames it or that separates it from or isolates it from the other elements on the page to be consistent or a multiple thereof. For instance, let's go back here and take a look at this real quick. I'm going to pull this down a little bit. Let's say that this center paragraph, and I'm going to make it italic here, just to kind of stand out just a little bit. Let's say this center paragraph is a block quote, a pull quote, something that needs to kind of stand out. Well, if I give it the same kind of spacing as all the other paragraphs in my document, you may mistake it as just another paragraph in a long line of paragraphs. But if I really want this to stand out, maybe I need to increase the spacing before and after. So in this case, I would make it double. So instead of 15 points, I would make it 30 points. Okay. I'll do the same thing here. Okay, space it out. So now I have 30 points of spacing before and 30 points of spacing after. So you see immediately that really isolates that paragraph. It changes the focus of that paragraph. You immediately notice it if you start reading at the top. Okay, but not only that, but I made sure that the spacing that I'm using is a multiple of whatever other spacing I'm using at that point. In other words, I'm being consistent. If I increase the spacing, I don't just increase it by 1 or 2, I increase it by a multiple of what I've been using up to that point. And because I'm basing that all on my leading becomes just as an important measurement as your measured length does for horizontal rhythm. So when we talk about vertical rhythm or horizontal rhythm, what we like to do is we like to think about things in terms of leading for your vertical rhythm and let that leading determine things like spacing between elements, like we've done here. Increasing or doubling that or tripling that sometimes to create isolation. When we talk about horizontal, we're talking about a rhythm based on the measure length, which is going back to that copy fitting table, which of course all boils down to what typeface you're using and what font size you're using. See how this is all fitting together. The main point I want to get to you is that we're not just arbitrarily coming up with measurements. We're not just saying, oh, well, that kind of looks good, so that's what we're going to use. There's a method to our madness. There's a reason that we can point to it and go, yes, we chose that particular size of text because this is the typeface that we're using, because this is considered an ideal measure length, because we want to make it easy on the individual to be able to read it. And that the leading that we're using is set because we're using a sans serif font that happens to be a slightly heavier typeface. So we wanted to increase the leading because we wanted to make it easier on the user, or the reader. So do you see how I'm justifying my design decisions instead of just saying, well, it just kind of look good? You don't ever want to do that. I'm justifying it using the rules of typesetting. Okay, so with that being said, real quick, let me wrap up this section and talk about orphans and widows. And you probably have talked about orphans and widows, hopefully in another class up to this point, but let me explain orphans and widows with a kind of a quick saying that may help it stick in your head. Now, what do I mean by orphans or widows? Well, whenever you're dealing with, and let me just, let's do this. Let's say that this particular text, let me do this paragraph here. It's a good example right here. So you kind of see how this paragraph ends with a single word, okay? Or I may have a line of text. Let's say this, whoops, where did it go off to? I moved it, sorry. Let me get this back. Let's say this page ends with the first line of a new paragraph, and the rest of the paragraph's on the next page. Well, what are these kind of elements called? Well, these are called orphans and widows. So let me explain what the terminology is by giving you this little saying. The saying goes something like this. Orphans have no past, but they have a future. Widows have a past, but no future. I know that it's a really dark saying, but it makes sense. And this is a saying that it's an old topographer's kind of saying. Let me say it one more time so it kind of sinks in. An orphan has no past, but it has a future. Okay? In other words, something follows it. A widow has a past, but has no future. In other words, nothing comes after it. So if we take a look at this particular word, does it have a past? Does something come before it? Well, yeah, the rest of the paragraph. Does it have a future? No, that's the end. This is what we would call a widow. If we look at this line, and we're assuming this is the first line of a paragraph, and the rest of the paragraph's on the next page, does it have a past? No, there's nothing that comes before it. Does it have a future? Yeah, the rest of the paragraph. This is an orphan. See how that works? Now, there are other definitions of orphans and widows, but these are the two particular examples that I wanted to show you because I want to show you how these two areas or how these two things can be fixed. First off, let's talk about how to fix this particular orphaned line. To fix this orphan line, I would simply move this line to the next page. Okay? I would move it with the rest of the paragraph. Okay? Not a problem. If that leaves a little bit of extra space at the bottom of the page, that's perfectly acceptable. Not a problem. But how about fixing this widow? How do I do that? Well, to fix a widow, here's what you do. You give the widow company. So what does that mean? Well, in this case, I would move this line, maybe this word down. If that wasn't enough, maybe I'd move a couple of words down. Now, notice I'm leaving a big space up here. But again, in order to fix a widow, I need to give it company. If by giving it company, I end up with a little bit extra space, it's considered acceptable in typesetting. Okay? Now, there's a very specific way I move those letters down. I did not simply hit return on the keyboard. I used what's called a forced line break. Now, you can do that on the keyboard by holding down the shift key and then hitting return. Okay? Or you could do that in the type by going to white space and choosing forced line break. It's up to you. Either way would work just fine. But the point is, I'm not creating a new paragraph by simply hitting return. See how that created a new paragraph? I'm hitting shift return to force that to start a new line within the same paragraph. That's how a forced line break works. All right. So with that, we're done with the rules of typesetting. Last thing I want to talk about real quick is framing the text. Specifically, I want to talk about margins and some of the elements that may actually go into the margins. So if we talk about this particular page right here, The margins, hopefully you understand what a margin is. The margin we typically consider to be, let me move this over. We consider the margins the white space that frames the text. So in this case, any page will have 4 margins. A lot of times we'll consider that to be the top margin, the bottom margin, the left margin, and the right margin. In this case, it's a single page. You could call it that if you want. But traditionally, they have different names. The names are the head, the foot, and because this is a single page, it is the foredge. So this is the right foredge and the left foredge. If, however, I was creating a book has a spine, right? So I'm going to create a book here, let's say 4 pages for the book, okay? And come down here to a spread of 2 pages. Now I've got a head, a foot, a foredge on this side, and a foredge on this side, but the margins in the middle where they come to meet at the spine are called the spine edge, okay? The head, the foot, the foredge, and the spine edge. Those are the 4 margins. Now, why are margins important? Well, margins protect and frame the content. What do I mean by that? Well, let's add some text here and let's talk about that. I'm going to create 2 text frames. I'm going to select this one, click the little box, link it to this one, and go ahead and fill it with placeholder text. Okay, so take a look at the white space generated by the margins. If we take a look at this, what's happening is, think of it as a picture frame. It is framing the content, it's framing the text. It's very important to frame the text. Because if we didn't, and we just had text go from one edge of the page all the way across the spine, we wouldn't know where one line ends and another line begins from one page to the other. So it's important to actually have proper margins. But furthermore than that, margins do more than just framing the text. They also protect the text. And here's what I mean by this. Whenever you're reading a book, you tend to read like this, right? And when we hold on to a book, the only fingers, quote unquote fingers, that may interfere with our reading are these guys, our thumbs. Well, pick up a book right now. I'll wait. Could be any book, just not a comic book. And open it up like you would normally read it. Now, some of us read with our hands down at the bottom, but just like you would open it with 2 hands like this. And notice where your thumbs go. Now I want you to notice the margins. Is the margin big enough so that your thumb does not cover the text? Think about that. In my case, they are, because Robert Bringhurst knew what he was doing. But have you ever gotten to a book where you're playing like this thumb war with your eyes? You're reading and you're constantly shifting your thumb up and down the page because it's covering part of the paragraph? The reason why that happened is because the margin wasn't big enough, because it wasn't protecting the text from its biggest enemy, your thumb. So again, a layout decision that some people may not have thought about or decided to just forget altogether or just not do can cause the reader anguish, can cause it to be difficult to actually do. So your margins need to protect the text as well as frame it. So what does that mean? Well, in traditional typesetting rules, here is how you would set up your margin. You would figure out what margin you would use for the head of your document. Now, in our case, by default, InDesign sets up a 1/2 inch margin. So let's just go with a 1/2 inch as an example. Okay, so I'm going to create a brand new document here. So if I come down here to margins, I'm going to unlock this. My top margin is currently set to 1/2 an inch. So let me change that to inches so everyone can kind of see. Okay, so InDesign calls this top, inside, outside, and bottom. That's the top margin. The bottom margin is the foot. The inside margin is the spine, where the inside meets, and the outside is the foredge. Okay, those are the 4 we're talking about. So traditionally, you would start off with the top or the head margin, so it's 1/2 inch. You would then make the spine, or in this case the inside margin, the same amount, 1/2 inch. But what you would do to the foot and the foredge is you would double it. So in this case, for traditional layout, my bottom would be double, so it'd be 1 inch, and the outside, the foredges, to get, protect it from the thumbs, would also be 1 inch. So if I also make this 4 pages, let's take a look and see what this looks like. Now, that first page looks really wonky, right? But when I look at the spread, check this out. This would be considered a traditional layout when it comes to margin. Notice how much bigger the foredges are right here. All right, that would really protect you from the thumb. And the footer, the extra space in the footer, the idea is that that's where footnotes go. Not only that, that's where page numbers go. And by the way, from a traditional typesetting perspective, page numbers are known as folios. So folios would go in the foot. Or you would also have information, maybe running headers, in the actual foot itself. You may have seen this in various books where it will have the name of the book or the author in the actual foot or the bottom margin, okay, or maybe the chapter name that you're on or the chapter number that you're on. So the foot, the added size of the foot would allow it to have content that is necessary to navigate the book. Page numbers, folios, or some sort of running information that goes along the bottom of the book. Or even footnotes, hence the name. Footnotes comes from the foot, okay? One other thing I want to point out about this, if you take a look at the 1 inch that we have here on the foredges, remember I was talking about horizontal rhythm? Well, horizontal rhythm can also be done with your margins. Look at this. My foredges are 1 inch each. My spine edge I set to 1/2 inch, but notice the inside margins, the spine edge margins, there are 2 of them. They're side by side. Well, if one's 1/2 inch and the other one's 1/2 inch, what is that total? 1 inch. So if I look horizontally across my layout, I have 1 inch of space, 1 inch of space, and 1 inch of space. Now I have consistency, and now I have rhythm. So framing your text, traditionally speaking, framing your text with your margins, protecting your text with the foredges from the thumbs is an important aspect of layout. We don't always follow these traditional rules these days, but I want you to start thinking about using them in your layouts here early on in digital publishing too. Last thing I want to talk about is traditional layout when it comes to text and multiple paragraphs. I already mentioned earlier, if we're putting space between the paragraphs, we want to be consistent. And I said use the same amount of leading or use the same space that you would use for your leading. So if I have 14 points of leading, I would have the space between the paragraphs be 14 points. Now, putting spaces between paragraphs is actually considered a more modern layout. But what if I want traditional layout? Well, traditional layout was a little bit easier. What you would do is anytime you start a new chapter or a new section, the very first paragraph would be laid out flush left. In other words, here's my first paragraph. Okay? The first word of this paragraph would be flush. Then I would not put any spaces between the paragraphs. What I would do instead is I would actually create an indent. I would indent the first line of every following paragraph. And in this case, I would usually indent it by the amount of leading. So if I have 14 points of leading, I would come up here where I have my first line indent and set my first line indent to the same amount of leading. It's what we call one lead. Now if we take a look at this layout, you can see where the paragraphs begin by the indentation. This is considered a traditional layout, and a lot of times what we would do is we would also set that up to be justified, which again, given its horizontal rhythm, would make those indentions stand out even more, would give those indentions more contrast. So, typesetting rules, units of measurement, framing the text, traditional typesetting. These are the things that we're going to be talking about, and these are the things that I expect you to use in assignment number 1. So, on Blackboard, please go find assignment number 1. It is called Typesetting and Framing, and here's what you're going to do. Each and every one of you will download a zip file on Blackboard. It's called A Modest Proposal. This is actually the Jonathan Swift satire, A Modest Proposal. You will be responsible for laying this out in multiple pages. The instructions are here on assignment 1. Please make sure you read through them first before you begin. Follow along exactly how you need to set up your document and what you need to do based on this particular lecture. If you have any questions about assignment 1 or anything that I've gone over in this lecture, please make sure you email me. Again, my email address is located on the ICR. Hopefully, I will be with you guys next week, but until then, have a good time, enjoy this, have a little bit of fun, and play around with this based on the typesetting rules we talked about today and that copy fitting table that is up on Blackboard. All right, have a good weekend.